Hello everyone and welcome to a new video tutorial within my Ultimate Guide series. Today we're going to focus on glazing. So what we're going to work on is going to be the cape, of the Custode here. Seeing if I can get it to focus. All right, there we go. The cape of the Custode here, it is a little bit complicated because there is so many folds, but nonetheless, I would be mainly glazing on an element like this, because it's more like a polished kind of character, or how do you say, like the Custodes are of course more like shiny gold and these popping red elements. So for me, I also want it to be more like a kind of a silky kind of material. So therefore, glazing would be a quite good technique to go with for the cape here. The term glazing, it's important to say that it's very different from painter to painter. So when someone says glazing, you automatically think about the paint mix to be quite thin, and that you build up the brightness and the shadows with very thin layers. When I use the term glazing, I more think about a kind of a layering. So I never really, I'm sure if you've seen some of my other video tutorials where I blend colors, I don't dilute the paints that much. I add around a half part water, almost maximum half part water. So when you see me mix my paints that we're going to start with here, I'm sure you will notice that I actually don't add that much water that you would probably see with other painters. But nonetheless, I use the term glazing for pretty much for building up my transitions from the darker midtone up to the brightest highlight. And within this glazing term, I also add like scratches and like small dots here and there. So it's kind of a mix of both glazing and more traditional stippling, where you add dots to add some texture, and adding scratches. So it's somewhere in between that. But I try to separate stippling and glazing from each other. If I've made a video tutorial about stippling, that's where I mainly use stippling. So that's like 80% of what I do in that video is for stippling. Where in this video, I want to focus more on how I build up my transitions with regular layering or glazing. It'll make more sense when I show it. So it was just important for me to put that information out, so you don't start wondering, well, this is not how this painter glazes, or this is not how he or she uses this term. All right, so to begin with, over here, I want to keep it quite simple, the paints we use. So I'm only going to use like 3 different or 2 different reds and 1 bright orange. And then over here I have a brown black, which I use quite a lot, but you can just use a black if you want to, or a darker red. So to begin with, the base coat, it's going to be our our Nocturnal Red from Vallejo Game Color. It's my favorite darker mid-tone red. It covers quite well too. So when I add my base coat, I actually never add any water. So I would just add this straight on the element that I'm painting, add maybe 2 or 3 layers until it covers, and then I can proceed from there. So when we've added our base coat, this is from this point where we start building up our transitions, or as we are working on today, glazing to build up our transitions. So I'm going to take my Nocturnal Red, which is our, I would say it's below our mid-tone, so it's a bit darker. And then I'll slowly add small amounts of Bloody Red, also from Vallejo Game Color. So as I add Bloody Red, I want like a pure Bloody Red in the end. And that's where I start adding my highlight color, which is Fire Dragon Bright from Citadel. Alright, so that's our transitions. For every single step, I go from our darkest color to our brightest. I'm going to add around a half pot of water. So what I usually do is that I basically just dip my brush on the side here of my wet palette. And then add it to my mix. So this is actually a bit too thin compared to how I normally would. So let's say that we are halfway through and I want to build up my Bloody Red. You can see here, I just dip the brush gently in the side, on the side here, and then I add it to the mix. So you'll see the paint mix is going to be something like this for every single step. So you can see it covers quite well. It's not like a highly diluted mix. If I add more water, some painters would probably go in back and forth, building up, where I actually put, the way I glaze is that I put more pressure on the area where I want it to cover the most. So let's say that, let's take a cylinder here, for example. So if I want the center of the cylinder to have the most to be covered by my Bloody Red or anything brighter than that, I'm going to take my Bloody Red, add a little bit of water, and then as I push it towards the center, this is where I put more pressure on it. So you can see it leaves more right there. The same over here. I take it from one side and then put more pressure on the brush as I get in towards the center here. So to begin with, lesser pressure, and as I meet the center, more pressure. You can see here how it leaves the most of the mix on my brush in the center here. So when we do this faster, we're going to get a transition from a more diluted red to a more of a pure red in the center. So if I take, once again, take our brighter highlight colors over here, I'm going to start a bit further in, and then I put more pressure in here, same here, back and forth. And this is going to leave the most of our paint mix that we have on our brush in the center. And by doing that over and over again, we're going to have a transition from our darkest mix into our brightest part of the mix. So always go from each side of whatever part you are working on and push it towards that center. And what you will also see me do is that if I feel like the transition is a little bit too rough, I can sometimes go over it by adding some scratches or some dots, and that's going to kind of take away the focus from any rough transitions. So that's why I always get this kind of textured look on whatever I'm painting. It's just a part of my build-up of the transitions. So yeah, so you can see here, less is more when it comes to the amount of water. Not more than a half part of water. It all how do you say, it comes down to the brush control. Start with lesser pressure. The more you get towards the center of the area where you want to have the most of the paint that you have in your brush, that's where you put the pressure in. It will make sense when I show it on the cape here. And just to be transparent here, I use a size 1 from Artist Opus S series. This is one of the brushes I use the most, this one or a 0 or a 00. We're going to cover some larger surfaces and some smaller ones on the cape here, so I might switch in between the size 1 here and a size 00. It just comes down to covering smaller surfaces. Then my own experience is that it's better with smaller heads on the brush. All right, let's get our base coat done. All right, as always, we want to have a look at the reference photo. So as I explained before, if we have some parts on our reference photo where it's the brightest, that's where we want to drag our mix towards. So an example of this could be, for example, this flat area here. You can see that's brighter than the one over here. There is a shadow there. So here I would probably push the mix towards the brightest area on this fold there. The same here, always pushing it towards the brightest area. You can also just work with your brush going back and forth, leaving the most of the mix, and by leaving it there, that's where you need to put the pressure on it. So it's just to show you how I approach the reference photo. Where I always leave my brushstroke is always at the brightest point on the reference photo. All right. So let's start with our base coat, which was our pure nocturnal red, and then we can continue. So you can see I'm not adding any water at all here. I just want a fast coverage. This might take 2 to 3 layers. All right, let's start building up those light reflections here. So we have our base coat, which is the nocturnal red. Now we're going to add around a quarter to a half of bloody red. Always, as I always say, less is more. So go with a quarter, start with that, add your, or dip the tip of your brush down in the side of your wet palette. This means that if we dip the brush down in our cup with water, we can easily get too much. So this is also a way of controlling it. Now I take a look at my reference photo. Edges here, we can just do like a basic edge highlight. When it gets to some of the larger surfaces here, what I do is I go all the way to the corner or the deepest recess here. Then I always have a look at my reference photo, taking a look where the reflection starts. So that's what I call the frame of the reflection, and where it ends. So you can see here, what I'm doing with the brush is that I am once again leaving the brush stroke where I want the most of the mix to be. So starting with a little bit of pressure and then ending it down in the area where I want to have the most of the mix here. So because I'm video recording this, it's a bit difficult to turn and twist it around. I would normally go in other directions. But now we can load our brush again. And you can see I'm ending the brush stroke down here in the center. On the photo, there is the most light around the recess here, and then it stops around here in the center. So what you could do is also flip it over. And once again start where the reflection fades out and end your brush stroke in the center. So what I also mentioned when we went through the wet palette was that I add these kind of scratches. So that could, for example, be in between these two areas that we just worked on. So for example there, just go with a scratch on top. Then it's kind of going to combine these two reflections, but we still have our shadow in between. So I simply just continue doing this. on all the remaining areas. And you can really see that I'm letting the tip of the brush do the most of the work. It gives us the most control, and at the same time it means that we don't need to dilute the paint that much, because we're adding very, very tiny brush strokes, because we're basically just using the tip of the brush. So when you get the grip of it, you can speed it up and go over the areas a couple of times. I would say I would wait until it's dried up and then add maybe 2 to 3 layers, something like that, for every step I build up the reflections. So I will continue doing this on the remaining areas. So I think it'll take around 10 minutes or something like that, and then we can continue. Alright, so this is our first layer done here. What we're going to do now is that we're going to, for every single time we want to add more brightness to our red, we simply just add around a quarter of our bloody red to the same mix. So for example, now I've added a quarter, and now I'm moving more towards the center of our light reflections here. For every time I do this, I focus on getting even more of the tip of the brush to work towards the center of the reflection. So once again, putting just a little bit lesser pressure on the brush when I'm moving from outside and inwards. When every time I get to around the center, that's where I put the pressure on it. And once again, with this technique, I'm basically pushing the brush towards that area, but you can also do the back and forth one where you do it from one direction and then moving in the other direction. In that way, ending your brush stroke in the center of our light reflections. And when you get the grip of it, you can speed it up a little bit more. And add these scratches in between every time. So you can see now we're slowly building up the reflections by using this kind of, well, as I call it, my kind of glazing technique here. And this is basically what I do every single time I want to build up transitions. And add a couple of scratches on top of the shadowed areas. Once again, add a couple of scratches and put a bit more pressure towards the center here. So once again, I will be continuing doing this on the other areas, and at the same time, I'll keep on adding these small amounts of bloody red until it's pure bloody red, and then we can add our final highlights. All right. We now have pure bloody red around the center of the light reflections, and what you probably saw as some of the final steps I did just before was that I went over with some quite thin layers of the bloody red just on top some of my transitions here, just to blend it a little bit more together with the shadows. So here I add around maybe one full pot of water, and then I just drag it over just towards the areas where we have the shadows. This is just going to, once again, blend the transitions a bit more together. So it acts more like what someone would call a filter, because we're filtering down some of the areas that we have painted here. So this can be a quite good way of just blending your already blended transitions together, but just to give it a little bit more of a cohesive feeling all over the areas. Also because you can see that the base coat is a bit more satin than our bloody red. So you can see when we twist it around in the light from our lamps, we can see there is a little bit of glossiness on our base coat, and we want everything to be kind of matte. So it's a really good way of just getting a bit more of a matte finish all over these areas. We could of course also just take a matte varnish and do it, but this is also a really good way, as I said before, to blend it a bit more together. All right, so now we're going to take our bloody red once again, and we're going to take around a quarter of our Fire Dragon Bright. There is quite a lot of pigment in this paint, so once again, less is more. Take the half of a quarter if you feel like it's a bit too big of a step. And now we're going to hit the very center of the light reflections. So here I'm really just trying to hit that area that I can see on my photo where there is the most light. That's our brightest highlight that we can see on our reference photo. So here I'm really not putting that much pressure. I've seen some painters call it like feathering, because we're just like kind of tickling with the tip of the brush here. But I'm still adding these tiny scratches and dots here and there. At this stage we can also add a edge highlight on all the edges, especially the ones that are around an area where there is a lot of light. Because as we can see on our reference photo, there is always a lot of light hitting these edges here, so they catch a lot of light, and we don't want to miss out on that. Once again, need to turn the model in the direction that makes sense for our direction of our brush stroke. So you can see I want to have a lot of light in some of these recesses, which means that I need to turn it towards that angle so I can reach these areas. Same over here. What we can also do here is angle it this way, because we have a lot of light hitting in the recess here. I can get more control over the tip of the brush. We're going to shade some of the areas down afterwards. So by doing that, we're going to bump up the contrast even more. Now I'm going to add around a quarter more of Fire Dragon Bright. I want it to be just slightly brighter, especially on the areas on the upper half here. I want to have the most brightness up here, the most focus. So now I'm just going to kind of leave it around there. And as we go even further up, I add the final quarter, which means we have like a, what is, I would say, a 1-to-1 mix at this stage of Bloody Red and Wild Rider Red. And now I'm especially going for the edges here that catches the most light. and the very center of our light reflections. So once again, it's a good idea to turn it over so we can hit that sharp edge there. Same here. All right. Now the final thing. We need to shade some of the recesses a bit more down. Here I'm going to take brown black, make a 1-to-1 mix of brown black and nocturnal red. Now I want to go in between some of these areas here where we don't have any light. You can see we're separating those folds a little bit more. Which will make them stand out even more from each other. And this is of course a stage where you really need to concentrate, because we don't want to have this darker mix all over the place. If we want, we can also create some even more dramatic shadows. So for example, on the lowest part right here, where we don't really have that much light hitting, we can shade it down a little bit. Same over there. And so on. We can also do the same on the folds down here, like it's been dragging it on the ground, which is going to help us with getting even more contrast on our brighter red areas. So you can see I'm just adding some dots as I go further up. This is going to help us with the transition. And I'm still using the same mix from before. We can thin it down a little bit more, adding around 1 part of water, and just let it blend in. It gives a bit more overall contrast to it. So yeah, I mean, we can leave it here. We can course also go even brighter. If you want some of these very sharp edges to pop a lot more, then we can take 1 part more of Fire Dragon Bright. So this is a 1.5 part of Fire Dragon Bright to 1 part of Bloody Red. And then really just focus on some of these sharpest edges here. It's kind of what you see on heavy metal painted capes. They have these on all of the sharpest edges. It's almost like they're almost like a pure orange. That will make it pop just a little bit more. We don't want to forget the recesses inside here, because they also catch a lot of light. And yeah, there we go. So the different areas that we have glazed have turned up with I would say a more silky-ish kind of touch to the cape here. If we stippled it or added like a whole dozen of scratches, it would look more textured, so you can kind of control it that way. We also added a transition to the lower part of the cape, once again just slowly building it up, having the transition by glazing with the darker red mixed with a dark brown. And yeah, this is basically how I would approach a glazed cape. So now we have a stippled red cloth as well, and now a glazed version, and you can tell on both of them that they are different in appearance. So yeah, I hope you'll find this useful, and just stay tuned for more tutorials soon, guys. Bye.